Hello, everyone, and welcome to your Webster Read-Along book. Every time you hear this chime, it means it's time to turn the page in your storybook. Now, if you are ready, we will start Webster Goes to Washington. Don't forget to turn the page every time you hear the chime. All right, let's begin. Webster raced into his room and hopped on the bed.
Oh, do I have to go to bed, ma'am?
He complained.
I'm too excited to sleep.
Catherine sat down beside Webster.
You need your rest,
she explained.
Tomorrow is going to be a big day. Our flight to Washington, D.C. leaves early in the morning.
I still can't believe my essay on what America means to me won the contest,
Webster said proudly as he slipped under the covers. George smiled down at Webster.
You'd better believe it. Tomorrow we start a week-long vacation in Washington. All expenses paid. Your prize for winning the contest.
The next morning, the huge jet streaked down the runway. With engines roaring, it climbed high into the sky. Seated at the window, Webster exclaimed,
"Wow, flying is great! Will it take long to get to Washington?"
Catherine took out a booklet from her purse as she answered.
No, Webster, only a few hours. Besides, I have this booklet about Washington, D.C. to make the time pass quickly. It's full of interesting facts about our nation's capital.
Bet I know most of them,
said George, pointing at the book.
Just ask me anything about Washington, Catherine.
Okay, who was the first president to live in the White House?
George scratched his head and looked puzzled.
George Washington?
Catherine shook her head and pointed to the correct answer. Webster read it.
Washington chose the site of the White House, but never lived there. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House.
Well, I was close,
grunted George. He paused a minute.
I bet you didn't know that the Washington Redskins football team was once called the Boston Braves.
Catherine smiled sweetly and said,
I didn't know that.
It looks like we're all going to learn a lot about Washington,
said Webster happily. After the plane landed in Washington, George, Catherine, and Webster checked into their hotel. Then they were off on a sightseeing tour.
Our first stop will be Ford's Theater,
Catherine said as she pointed to a street map of the city.
That's where President Abraham Lincoln was shot. Do you know who shot him?
Webster nodded.
John Wilkes Booth. We studied about it in school.
After a few blocks' walk, they reached the theater. An attendant took them inside and explained,
President Lincoln was watching a play called Our American Cousin when he was shot by Booth. The wounded president was taken across the street to William Peterson's house. There, Honest Abe died. You can visit the Peterson house, too.
Thanks, we will,
said Webster as the family turned to go. On the way out, Webster found a quarter lying on the floor. He picked it up and handed it to the attendant, explaining,
Somebody must have lost this.
George smiled down at Webster and said,
Honest Abe would be proud of you.
That night after dinner, Catherine told George and Webster,
Considering where we went this morning, I know the perfect place to visit this evening. Let's hop into this taxi.
A short while later, the taxi stopped in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and the three visitors got out. Webster looked up in admiration at the famous monument, then said softly,
Abraham Lincoln was a great man. He believed that men of all races and creeds are created equal, and that no man should be another man's slave. So he freed America's slaves.
George knelt down and gave Webster a big hug.
Lincoln was certainly right, and so are you, Webster.
Catherine stood watching her two men proudly. Wiping a tear from her eye, she said,
That's enough sightseeing for today, men. I'm tired, and you should be too.
Holding hands, George, Catherine, and Webster walked back to the waiting taxi. The next morning, Webster's alarm clock woke him. He jumped out of bed and opened the door to the adjoining room. George and Catherine were already dressed and waiting for him.
Hurry up, sleepyhead.
Called Catherine, smiling.
There's lots more to see.
Their first stop was the Pentagon. As they stood in front of the huge 5-sided building, Catherine read from her guidebook.
The Pentagon is the headquarters of the Department of Defense. It has 3 times more floor space than the Empire State Building.
The Department of Defense?
Said Webster thoughtfully.
Now that reminds me of a military joke. Where does a general keep his army?
Catherine shrugged her shoulders. George said,
We don't know. Where?
A general keeps his armies in his sleeves.
Said Webster, laughing. Catherine and George laughed at Webster's joke, too. Later, they visited Arlington National Cemetery, where brave men and women who fought for their country are buried. Catherine and George said a silent prayer as Webster placed a flower on the resting places of President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy. As the day neared its end, the family visited the United States Marine Corps War Memorial with its famous World War II statue of Marines raising the American flag on Iwo Jima. After Webster took a picture of the statue, he turned to Catherine and George and said proudly,
I know what America means to me. It means freedom and, if necessary, fighting to keep my country free.
In the days that followed, Webster, Catherine, and George enjoyed the many sights Washington had to offer, including the towering Washington Memorial.
It sure is big,
said Webster, looking up to the top.
It reminds me of a giant needle,
added George.
The Washington Memorial is over 550 feet high,
explained Catherine as she read from her guidebook. One of the greatest thrills for the vacationing trio was their tour of the Capitol building. The tour guide explained,
Dr. William Thornton, an amateur architect, submitted a plan for the Capitol in 1793. For his design, Dr. Thornton won $500 and a city lot.
A big smile crossed Webster's face as he exclaimed,
Gee, he won a contest just like I did.
The weeks sped by quickly, and on their next to last day, George asked Catherine,
Where to today?
Today we spend the entire day at the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian is the largest museum gallery in the entire world.
Hooray!
Cried Webster.
I want to visit the National Museum of Natural History first.
Inside were dioramas of people and animals in their natural settings. There were meteorites and jewels and dinosaur fossils, too.
Look at all the teeth on the Tyrannosaurus,
marveled George.
I sure hate to have his dentist bill,
teased Webster. In the afternoon, they visited the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. They saw Charles Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, John Glenn's Mercury space capsule, and samples of moon rocks brought back by astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin.
What do you think of the moon rocks?
Catherine asked Webster. Webster chuckled.
They're far out.
On the final day of their Washington vacation, Catherine made an important announcement.
I've saved the best for last. Today we visit 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
What's that?
Asked George, puzzled.
The White House,
yelled Webster. George, Catherine, and Webster were very excited as they began their guided tour of the president's house. The guide explained to the tour group.
The White House grounds consist of 18 acres, including the famous Rose Garden, which is now in bloom. Now, if you'll follow me, we'll go inside.
The guide led the group into the Blue Room on the first floor and explained.
The Blue Room is the main reception room. It contains 7 chairs and a French clock, all dating back to 1817, when President James Monroe furnished the White House.
Webster pointed at a portrait on the wall.
Look at that,
he said to Catherine.
That's President George Washington,
said Catherine. The guide pointed to the other walls and explained.
In addition to Washington's portrait, this room contains portraits of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, James Monroe, and John Tyler.
George turned to Webster as the tour moved on.
In those days, people had to sit for hours and hours if they wanted a picture of themselves.
Webster sighed and replied.
Then I sure do appreciate my instant camera even more.
The next room on the tour was the ground floor library. Webster looked in amazement as the guide explained.
There are 2,780 books in here. They were selected by a special committee in 1963 and placed in the library. Almost all of them were written by American authors.
Isn't that interesting?
Catherine said to George as the tour moved on. Webster found it interesting. Too interesting. He was still staring at the books for several minutes after the last person on the tour group left the room. Suddenly, Webster looked around him.
Hey, where did everybody go?
He raced out of the room into the hall, but there was no one in sight.
I'd better find the others,
Webster said as he walked down the hall, turning into one corridor after another, but he couldn't find anyone from his group. After wandering around for about an hour, Webster heard the clock chime 12 o'clock.
That reminds me and my stomach that it's lunchtime. I'm starving after all that walking.
Webster stopped and leaned against a door. The door swung open and Webster toppled into a room. It was the Oval Room. A man and a woman were sitting there. They looked very familiar to Webster.
Well, Nancy,
said the man,
it looks like we have an unexpected visitor in our private sitting room.
Webster froze in his tracks and stared. He couldn't believe his eyes.
Excuse me, Mr. President.
Webster gulped.
And you too, Mrs. First Lady. I got lost.
That's okay,
said the First Lady.
Sometimes I get lost in this big house myself. Are you all right, young man?
Webster nodded.
I'm fine, except I'm a little hungry.
Here, try some of these. They're my favorites,
said the President as he offered Webster a large jar filled with jelly beans. Webster took a big handful, saying,
Thank you, Mr. President.
You're welcome, son. Now I'll have one of my aides help you find your tour group. I'm sure they must be worried about you.
When Catherine and George saw Webster with a White House aide, they came running toward him in alarm.
Webster, what happened?
Cried Catherine.
Where have you been?
George sputtered.
We've been looking all over for you.
He was in good hands, folks, the President's aide explained as she walked away.
What did she mean by that?
George asked Webster. Webster smiled from ear to ear as he held up a jelly bean.
Webster, what is that?
Asked Catherine.
You might say it's a presidential suite,
he replied.
I can't wait to go home and tell my friends who I met in Washington, D.C.